Historically, global language education has operated like a strict funnel. Students arrive with rich, diverse ways of communicating, but the system demands they discard those variations to squeeze through a single, uniform doorway of standard dialects. For decades, the primary goal of English language teaching, or ELT, has focused on providing access. The objective was to give marginalized learners the specific tools required to assimilate into dominant linguistic norms, often at the expense of their native identities. Looking at the 2026 Virtual Symposium of Black English Language Professionals and Friends, or BELPaF, we see a catalyst for moving away from that assimilation model. The subtitle sets a new mandate: from access to agency, advancing linguistic equity in global contexts. In this context, agency represents the capacity of educators, researchers, and students to actively shape language policies and dismantle the ideologies that exclude them. Shifting the power dynamic of the ELT ecosystem requires operational, structural changes that move the field into the practical work of policy and pedagogy. This diagram illustrates a three-pillar agency architecture extracted directly from the Symposium's research tracks. The architecture relies on culturally sustaining pedagogy, decolonized curricula, and the active disruption of racial-linguistic labor hierarchies. These three pillars provide the interconnected structural overhaul required to legitimize diverse linguistic identities in global education. We start with the first pillar, classroom pedagogy, and how educators perceive the language students bring with them. Traditional education models inherently treat non-standard dialects as linguistic deficits, errors that must be corrected to achieve fluency. This session description by researchers Monique Mills and Tynasha Whitaker challenges that deficit-based model by examining Black English. They map narrative language from a strengths-based perspective, specifically analyzing how school-age children deploy the preverbal had construction in their storytelling. Validating these dialectical constructions as complex, rule-governed systems is the first step in transferring agency back to the student. This principle expands beyond specific dialects into a broader strategy for multilingual learners worldwide. Looking at Session 09, Wycliffe Memoria outlines a framework for translanguaging in African ELT classrooms. Translanguaging functions as a primary decolonizing pedagogy that integrates a learner's full linguistic repertoire into the learning process, moving past its use as a temporary crutch. Learner agency cannot exist under a strict, standard English-only hegemony. It requires an environment that recognizes and utilizes a student's entire linguistic background as a valid intellectual resource. Once the pedagogy shifts, the actual materials used to teach must follow, bringing us to the second pillar of the architecture. The global ELT textbook industry heavily enforces colonial norms, relying on generalized scenarios that distance learners from their lived realities. To counter this systemic issue, educators must evolve from passive textbook consumers into active creators of context-responsive curricula. This session by Fatima Khalil Hamad provides a practical example of integrating non-traditional texts in teacher education. Palestinian TEFL students design curriculum units around freedom songs, explicitly connecting English language teaching to local realities, student voices, and culturally responsive pedagogy. Session 08 expands on this approach, examining music as a global decolonizing tool. By combining decolonizing theory with anti-racist pedagogical grammar, educators can directly support immigrant, refugee, and international students dealing with systemic erasure and trauma. Material design is never neutral. Educator and learner agency materializes only when the curriculum is anchored in historical recovery and active identity preservation. Zooming out from the classroom brings us to the global systemic architecture of the ELT profession, the final pillar. Attempts to build learner agency fail if the educators themselves face systemic marginalization. This visualization represents the transnational labor hierarchy that arbitrarily assigns professional validity based on geography, race, and language variety. The findings presented in Session 11 by John Odudele address the specific marginalization of Black African English teachers. These professionals face compounded discrimination tied to race, immigration status, and the fallacy of native speaker status, causing epistemic erasure of Africanness from the field. This systemic bias manifests differently based on nationality, driven by what is known as passport privilege. We see this dynamic detailed further down the program in Session 16, concerning Black American educators. Dr. Andwada L. Barnes explores how these teachers must navigate ratio-linguistic profiling and conditional Western privilege while working in regions like the UAE. Achieving global linguistic equity requires explicitly naming and dismantling this linguistic racism, ensuring the educators themselves have the agency to lead. The transition from access to agency requires a unified structural overhaul rather than a collection of isolated classroom adjustments. Reassembling our architectural model illustrates how these factors work together. Pillar 1 involves affirming diverse linguistic repertoires through practices like translanguaging, rather than punishing students for dialectical variance. Pillar 2 demands anchoring curricula in culturally sustaining, decolonized texts that reflect the lived realities of the learners. Pillar 3 necessitates the active dismantling of ratio-linguistic profiling and transnational labor hierarchies. When these three vectors work together, they support a single, non-negotiable goal: linguistic justice. This creates a stable, multi-directional framework, replacing the brittle, exclusionary funnel that historically defined the field. The research tracks presented by BELPaF outline exactly how this transformation occurs in practice. By operationalizing this architecture, the global language education ecosystem evolves into a pathway for true student empowerment, belonging, and collective leadership.